Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Regulator Roundtable. I'm Jeremiah DeGennaro, Site Manager at Alamance Battleground. In this video series, I'm speaking with authors who have written about the regulator movement during their careers to find out more from them about how the regulators figure into their own personal story and let them reflect on the legacies of the movement as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Alamance. Of the authors I've talked to, there's one that I've been particularly excited to talk to, and I'm going to go off script for this part of the introduction. When I started this project, I went looking for authors who had written about the regulators at some point in their careers. And so I scoured through journals, and I did what a lot of historians do, and I went on JSTOR and started searching for regulators. And I found this article that was written in 2012, or published in 2012. And it was written by a high school student named Sarah Sadlier at Charles Wright Academy in Tacoma, Washington. And it was published in The History Teacher, and it was called Prelude to the Revolution, The War of Regulation, A Revolutionary Reaction for Reform. And I thought, gosh, I wonder what happened to this high school student who wrote about the regulators in Washington State. And sure enough, Sarah Sadlier is still very much in the history field and is doing some really great work. After high school, she went on to Stanford and a quadruple major in history, American studies, Iberian and Latin American cultures, and political science. She then went on to Harvard University, where she is currently a JD candidate and a history Ph.D. candidate. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. It is so good to talk to you.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to revisit this topic after over a decade. And it really was the thing that, started me on the track to become a history PhD student and eventually, hopefully, a history professor. So I couldn't be more excited to return to it.
And it's really great to be willing to come and talk about something that you wrote in high school. I know that of the things that I wrote during that time, I don't know how well I would be able to speak on some of those things. And so, yeah, it really means a lot that one, that not only did you, obviously remember this article, but you sent me a longer version of the article to look through. That was very helpful for me. I guess I got to get the first question out of the way. Our story, the regulator movement, it's intensely local. It's very well known in North Carolina, but not much elsewhere. So how does a high school student in Tacoma, Washington, come to write about the regulators?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very excellent question. To be honest, I've actually never been to North Carolina, and I've always wanted to go to the monument, and we'll be so excited to do that after quarantine and the pandemic someday. I'm now living in the Washington, D.C. area, so a little bit closer than the West Coast. So I was very interested in early American history, and in particular, something that's been a theme throughout my research over the course of my career has been looking at war in American memory and looking at the ways that we might publicly remember something is different from the facts on the ground. So I was interested in doing something around the 1760s and 1770s. So this kind of perfectly fit the bill for that. So I was looking through topics and speaking them over with my history teacher, and he was like, well, no one has really written about the trajectory of people after the battle. And I think that that would be really interesting to look at. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that would be like a nice, tight historiographical debate. I had participated for the last 3 years before that in the National History Day competition, was looking for a topic for a paper I could write for that. And I thought, hey, like this might be perfect. In that summer before my senior year, went to my local library in Tacoma, Washington, requested about like 100 books or so through interlibrary loan on this topic. I was very unusual, and the librarians were incredibly helpful. It was like very precocious high schooler who was doing this project. And another amazing resource that's still available is the Documenting the American South project, which had so many of the original papers on this topic that I was able to go through and look up individual regulators, what they were doing both before and after the movement, and seeing sort of their trajectories over time. So I started off writing about sort of the background of North Carolina, learning a lot about the dynamics in the backcountry and Piedmont area, and then delving into the individual figures in the battle as well. So I worked on it for about a year.
Wow.
And the original paper, as you mentioned, was longer. So it was around 90, I think, to 100 pages. And so I published that in the Concord Review, which is a great publication for high school students to sort of get mentorship in their work out there in high school and test out if they really like to write in the history fields. And then I had a more condensed version of the paper that I submitted for the National History Day project. So I highly encourage any high school students who are interested in doing local history, state history, et cetera, to check out the National History Day program. Almost 1 million high school students, middle school students participated in it annually. It's a really great opportunity. There is a local, state, national competition. You advance up through each level, and along the way, you get great feedback from judges on your work. So I was lucky enough to do that, and it was a really nice way to end my high school career. And getting the feedback on this paper made me think, wow, like, I'd always wanted to be a high school or middle school or even elementary school history teacher. And I was like, actually, I really love research. Like, maybe I should continue to do that. And so today I'm a PhD student in part because of this paper.
It's really amazing, and it's really nice to hear you talk about your involvement with the National History Day competition. I can tell you that North Carolina is very involved with National History Day, and especially locally at our level, the Alamance Community College always hosts our Regional History Day competition. And your story it's honestly very inspiring, and I hope that some of our students who are watching this are further inspired by it to keep pushing and keep going onward. I was really interested in the research element, writing it at that particular time where you were geographically. You're not around the state archive. You can't go to Raleigh to the state archives. You obviously rely a bunch on interlibrary loans. What was the state of the online research that was available? Was it pretty much Doc South and that was it?
Yeah, honestly, that had so many rich materials. One thing that I was really fortunate in high school that I had done History Day because it taught me to look at, the sources that other authors were citing in these secondary works. So I'd go and then see if those were also available online. I was able to get scans actually of some sources as well, so that was very helpful. But for the most part, a lot of my summer was just spent looking on Doc South and really digging into it. I tried to look for individual biographies too of some of these main figures. There weren't a lot. It's actually funny now because the family that I'm staying with in Baltimore during the pandemic actually is descended from some of the regulators. And so they have some amazing papers here that I was like, oh wow, I wish I had had these back in the day when I was writing this paper to incorporate them into this history.
Wow.
If I were to go back and do this project again, now knowing more about doing oral histories, looking at family histories, had I been connected to people in the local area, I would have certainly investigated to see if I could find some of those family histories, because there are really rich individual family archives that I just didn't have access to in Tacoma, Washington.
Mm-hmm,
I think too, understanding more about the geography of North Carolina would have been helpful. A lot of this paper is focused on property and the tensions over land ownership and land speculation in North Carolina. So having a better sense of what that looked like rather than just looking up some individual pictures on Google would have been incredibly useful, I think. And now that I'm doing more environmental histories, histories where I am looking more at geography and people's relationship with the land, that's something that I wish I had access to, but didn't as a high school student.
Right. You still did pretty well under the circumstances, I would say. Now, with the family that you're staying with, I'm going to have to connect with you and find out who it is that they are descendants of.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, because we've really identified one of our key stakeholder groups at the site as descendants, because as you know, the primary source catalog is just so rich that someone doing family history, and it is also so personal with petitions and signatures and muster rolls and all that, that it's very easy for someone doing their family history to look back and find someone associated with this movement. And gosh, this is now the second time this has come up in a collection of, this is my fourth interview so far this week. So half of them, there's some kind of family connection of some kind to the regulator movement, which is just boggles my mind every time I hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's an incredibly rich source to look at, and also to understand. I was writing about the legacy of the war of regulation too, in memory. So particularly for that emphasis, it would have been helpful to have more access to families, or just to understand what in North Carolina, in that particular region, people still think about the war of regulation. I can honestly say I don't think a single person I ever talked to in Washington State had heard of it. And so they were
I'm not
very
surprised.
they were very curious that I had ended up on this topic. But I mean, I think it deserves to be more broadly known. It's incredibly interesting. A lot of the rhetoric about taxation and no taxation without representation, you do learn about in Washington State or other schools in the context of the American Revolution, but you don't see it as a rhetoric that existed before, or in a different context than the Patriots were using it.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I guess to get into a little bit detail with your paper, you are sort of hitting the popular memory of the regulation as some kind of forerunner to the American Revolution. You're hitting it head on, and you are very confident in the paper, saying that this just was not the case, and that's become an important part of our daily interpretation as well, of sort of disentangling the regulation from the revolution. You do a great job with it in the paper,
Oh, thank you.
and I'm glad to hear that you're interested in historical memory. That's something that I really feel very passionately about, and there's so much grist for the mill with Alamance Battleground, because you have these monuments at the site that just have chiseled in stone or cast in bronze, first battle of the Revolution. And we get to unpack all of that and what it says to us about the generations that put up those monuments. So you're interested in historical memory. I wanted to ask you, obviously there is this conflation of the regulators as revolutionaries. You've tried to address it. We try to address it at the site. Do you ever feel like these types of issues of historical memory, that they can be completely turned around? Can we change the narrative of the Battle of Alamance?
Yeah, I think that you can. I mean, part of it just takes a lot of work, not only doing the curriculum at your site, but also the curriculum that's taught to so many of us in our public elementary schools, where we learn about some of our major elements of our state history, where we're going on field trips to individual sites. I think that what you all are doing at the monument itself is really fantastic in terms of looking at those packs, complicating them. But I think it is easy in American history as sort of a linear progression. And so this, I think, in the 19th and 20th century in particular, was something that seemed to fit into that. And I think that now people are more critical, or at least more thoughtful, in thinking about the moments in which these monuments arose and that they were shaped in. And so hopefully the task becomes easier over the coming years. But I think that historians who are doing, the intricate work of picking apart these narratives, how they came to be, what they meant in the time in which they were originally created, is incredibly important work, and something that my master's in modern thought and literature at Stanford was completely focused on, more in American memory, and disentangling what happened from the memory of what happened, and memorials of those afterwards. So I think it's noble work that you all are doing. I think
Thank
that
you.
I can't wait to actually visit the site myself someday. But I think, again, these family histories are really important to complicate the individuals who were there, what their motivations were, and how they differed over time from maybe some of the more iconic Revolutionary War figures that we're familiar with. The much more elite cast of characters than some of the individuals here who aren't as highlighted in that history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's excellent. Very well stated. Could you tell me a little bit more about, was it, you said, your master's thesis where you were
Yeah.
talking about war and memory? I'd love to hear more about, how you've taken some of these ideas and developed them.
Yeah. So during my master's program, it's an interdisciplinary program. So you had to select sort of a theme that united all of your coursework over time. And no matter how far I've tried to stray away from different topics, the common theme that has always appeared is looking at recent war in American memory and thinking about those things. So in particular, I was focusing on the Battle of the Little Bighorn, very famous battle, obviously, many different accounts, a lot of memorialization work that was done. And so for that, I actually was looking like in film in particular about how the Battle of the Little Bighorn changed over time. So in Vietnam, there's basically a different film about the Battle of the Little Bighorn every single year in Vietnam. And it tracks actually very well with the American public's changing interpretations of what was happening in Vietnam. The My Lai massacre begins to appear via the form of the Battle of Washita or the Washita massacre. Eventually in 1975, there's a film about the court martial of George Armstrong Custer, which is like basically a film thinking, okay, if he had survived, how would we go back and try him for his crimes in the Indian Wars, which is so fascinating in thinking about, you know, the end of Vietnam, the American public's changing attitude toward war in general, the use of Indian country in Vietnam as a term to think about, you know, backcountry warfare, guerrilla warfare. And, you know, actually it kind of connects to this a little bit that I was looking at military tactics as well during the regulator movement too. So yeah, so these themes continue to appear in my work. And, you know, I think it's a really great way to also engage and interest people in history, because even if people aren't particularly familiar with, like, you know, the very specific things in the regulator movement, et cetera, popular images of American war have permeated throughout our society. And so it's a way to get people interested in history and thinking more critically about it, I think, to approach it from that perspective.
Looking back at this paper that you wrote, you spent a good bit of time on it. You have obviously grown by leaps and bounds as a historian and have, you know, just done all sorts of different things. You know, did you go back and look at this? Like when we were talking about setting up this interview, did you go back and look at the paper?
Yeah, you know, it was the first time I had revisited the paper. I actually had commented to you before the interview that I'm shocked my writing style hasn't changed significantly since the 11th grade, for better or for worse. But I think that one thing that I had done fairly well, I thought at the time, was set up the context of the war of regulation. And we had talked a little bit earlier in this interview about geography and rethinking like the very specific locational histories that you're working with. And now that my main focus in my PhD has been Native American and Indigenous studies, really there is not very much of that in this paper at all. It deals with land speculation, but of course, in the history of land speculation, in the history of this country, it's all based on Indian land. And, you know, the relationship between settlers and Native peoples in this area is something that I just really didn't explore in 11th grade at the time, partly because I was so reliant on secondary sources and kind of under my understanding and framing of the topic, and none of them dealt with this. So if I were to revisit this paper as the scholar that I am now, that would definitely be sort of the first thing I thought about in terms of reconstructing the context of this moment.
Yeah, I would certainly be very interested in seeing that perspective added as well. Not to say that, not to critique what you did, but really to say, you know, it's something that we've thought about at the site where, you know, you tell the story. You're sort of picking up in the middle of the story where you have all of these white farmers that are, they feel very strongly about, you know, the availability of land and the price of land, and the reason for that is because of Native Americans who only one generation prior had been there. That would be really interesting to see a, you know, a reinterpretation of the regulator through a Native American lens, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that actually at some point in my career, I can get back to this paper and revisit it. And a lot of my work since has been more 19th, 20th century focused. But I think because so many of us think of Native history in the way we're taught in elementary school as ending in this sort of early period, that it's important not only to disentangle the myth making that happens in the 19th and 20th century, but also in this very early period as well. And as you mentioned, the Catawba Indians are the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina. They call themselves the Yaiswa people. And I think that, you know, if I were to go back to family interviews, et cetera, of regulator descendants, I of course would also want to interview the tribal historian and of their nation as well, to get their take on the battle as well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so to wrap up, I wanted to ask, thinking back on this project, how did your research in the regulators in this research project, how did it affect your development as a historian? What is the legacy of this project for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was really the first time that I had ever delved into writing a paper, perhaps longer than 10 or so pages before, and really get into the nitty gritty of doing good historical work, thinking about setting up historical context, looking at change over time, looking at why things did or did not change, and also understanding what gaps in sources might tell us, how to deal with silences in the archive when you're trying to make an argument. And that was just an incredibly valuable experience to have in high school. And I think certainly it helped prepare me for college and my work that I did there. Also in my career, it was very critical, I think, in realizing that like, hey, I could actually do a full length project, somewhat independently, of course, with help and mentorship from others. But it was, yeah, it was a moment where I realized, hey, maybe I could be a writer. And I think that in thinking towards other projects that people might pick up in the future, that if you find something like in an area that you're particularly passionate about, for younger scholars, it may be helpful to look at things that maybe aren't so famous or on in your regular textbooks, but maybe might be like a sentence or line or two in AP history, and to go back and think, hey, like I have some questions about those. Let me go investigate them, see what's available. Use your local libraries. Librarians, archivists are your best friends, and get into them a little bit, not only through National History Day, but if you're thinking about doing a thesis maybe in college. Also, don't be afraid to email scholars. I think that's something that I was initially like nervous about, didn't know how to really reach out and use email. But in general, people are very generous with their time, especially in terms of mentoring younger people in the fields. And so if you are at all interested in pursuing a history project, please feel like you can reach out to some of these figures. They'll want to help you. People who are focused on a particular topic, or maybe someone who might have advice about where your project could go in the future. And if you just pose a couple questions, oftentimes they're available and willing to help. So feel free to reach out to me, actually, if you have any questions about doing like a history PhD, doing history major. In my contact info is available online. And yeah, I hope that you continue to be engaged in history, even if you don't want to go into history for your whole career. That doesn't stop you from doing a project like this. At the time, I wasn't necessarily planning on being a historian, but I was excited about learning more about something. So take these opportunities when they come.
That is great advice, Sarah. And you never know, you might be talking about your history project 10 years later on Zoom in the middle of a pandemic. Who knows? And yeah, I can definitely echo what you said about the willingness of scholars to help out. I mean, our conversation began with like a cold call email saying, hey, do you remember this paper that you wrote? And then would you like to come and talk about it? And you were just so gracious and so kind. And I really, really appreciate you speaking with me today. So Sarah Sadlier is, usually this is the part where I plug something. Do you have anything that you would like to talk about? What's coming up for you?
Oh no, I mean, sort of the future of my work is hopefully I'll get to my dissertation at some point. I'm very much in the bowels of law school right now, trying to wrap that up. But yeah, when I have a project in the works, I will definitely let you know.
Well, I'm greatly looking forward to seeing what comes next for you. So Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you
It was
so
a
much for
pleasure.
having me.